Canada and India are forging new diplomatic bonds, and it's happening precisely because both nations are under siege from the same source. United States President Donald Trump's 50% tariff on Indian goods took effect this week, while Canada appointed a new ambassador to India, a major step in the easing of tensions that erupted after officials accused the Indian government of involvement in murders and extortions on Canadian soil. This isn't coincidence, it's strategy. When two countries face the same economic pressure from the same superpower, they find common ground quickly.
U.S. goods, arguing they aren't the right tool for this current moment.
What we're doing, again, is matching what the U.S. is doing. That's fair. It's fair to match what they've done. And it puts us in a better position to focus in on exactly those sectors, work forward. So sometimes, to go back to the earlier question, you drop the gloves in the first period. When you're late in the game, dropping the gloves and taking the extra penalty might not be the best thing to do.
As trade tensions continue with the U.S., what could this mean for negotiations between the two countries? James Moore is a former conservative industry minister, and he joins me now. Hey, James, thanks for coming on.
Pleasure's mine.
How would you characterize what the Prime Minister has done here with the retaliatory tariffs? Is it a form of capitulation, a betrayal, or do you see it as, an act of goodwill to try and get a deal done?
I think it's appropriate for the moment, but there's a piece of his analogy that is unknown. He says that there are times in a hockey game where you do want to go into the corners, elbows up, and maybe drop the gloves, and there's times to be more disciplined and finesse things. But at the end of the analogy that you just played right there, as he said, when you're heading towards the end of a game and it's very close, maybe you don't want to take a penalty. So the question is, are we towards the end of the game? How close?
The timing couldn't be more telling. To understand why this matters, we need to grasp the scale of what Trump has unleashed. A 50% tariff on India will impact trade worth billions of dollars and risk Washington-New Delhi ties. Until recently, the U.S. was India's largest trading partner with annual bilateral trade worth $212 billion. That relationship is now in tatters. But here's where it gets interesting and where Mark Carney enters the picture. Mark Joseph Carney is a Canadian politician and economist who is the 24th and current Prime Minister of Canada since 2025. He previously served as Governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013 and as Governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. This isn't just any politician dealing with trade wars. This is someone who understands global finance at the deepest level. Carney's approach to the U.S.-Canada trade conflict has been methodical and strategic. As he explained recently, in hockey, you need to know when to drop the gloves in hockey and when to play disciplined.
Dropping the gloves and taking the extra penalty might not be the best thing to do.
His decision to remove most retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods wasn't weakness. It was calculated strategy designed to create space for negotiation, while the Trump administration was still willing to talk. Throughout the current trade negotiations with the United States, the Canadian government has steadfastly defended our workers and businesses. We will continue to do so as we work towards resolution. But Trump still imposed those crushing tariffs on Canada too. The result? A diplomatic revolution that Trump never saw coming. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand announced that Christopher Cooter will become Canada's High Commissioner in New Delhi, filling a position that had been vacant since last October, when each country kicked out each other's top envoys. This position had been empty for nearly a year until Trump's tariffs gave both countries a powerful reason to reconcile. Let's be clear about what caused this diplomatic freeze in the first place. The tensions between Canada and India weren't about trade or economics. They were about something far more serious. Canadian officials had accused the Indian government of involvement in murders and extortions on Canadian soil. That's not the kind of accusation that gets swept under the rug easily. But Trump's economic warfare changed the calculus entirely. When you're facing a 50% tariff from your largest trading partner, past grievances suddenly become secondary to economic survival. India also named its new High Commissioner to Canada. Dinesh Patnaik, currently ambassador to Spain, will take up the position in Canada shortly. The strategic thinking here is sophisticated. We are strengthening our trading partnerships throughout the world, Carney declared. This isn't just diplomatic speak, it's economic necessity. The reality is that Canada and the United States have built things together and sold them around the world for decades, with decades of integrated supply chains that cannot be easily unwound.
Tariffs. The difference with Canada is that those are precisely the sectors in which our economies are the most integrated. So if it's the automobile tariffs, the aluminum tariffs, softwood lumber is another example. For decades, we have integrated supply chains, just-in-time delivery. I've said before, Canada and the United States don't as much as sell things to each other, but build things together and sell them around the world. We've taken very, very tough measures, as has the United States, with respect to dumping from countries like China of steel and aluminum. So we're optimistic that we can continue to have those conversations with President Trump's administration and make the case that there's an economic opportunity for both countries if we reset some of those sectoral tariffs.
Yet Trump's tariffs are forcing exactly that unwinding. The Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper are severely impacting Canadian businesses, affecting jobs and investment decisions across the country.
Look at what Prime Minister Carney released late last week on Friday. They were very specific in this news release, in this press release, that said, look, when you look at the sort of reframing of trade with America, countries around the world, our competitors in trade, are paying 15%, up to 50% in some cases in terms of broad-based tariffs. But when we look at Canadian access to the the American market through CUSMA, about 85 to 90% of the products we sell them are going through tariff-free. But as you've mentioned, it's those areas like steel, aluminum, copper, auto parts. Those are what we call 232 tariffs. Those are the ones that are still having a really significant tariff put on them. And that's damaging to Canadian business, certainly. Our membership is feeling it at the Canadian Chamber, and we're seeing that affect jobs, affect investment decisions, and other things like that that are so critical for business. So they are damaging, but what this move does is it just to say, look, we're here with goodwill, we're negotiating with you, we're meeting you on the things we can agree on, but it's the other things like steel and aluminum that we need to focus the next step on. And that's where we see some sign of hope here, is that Canada is signaling, look, we're willing to be good partners here, but let's get to business on the parts that we can agree on, and that's steel, aluminum, copper, and auto.
When one door slams shut, you open another. When the United States becomes an unreliable trading partner, you diversify. For India, the situation is even more desperate. Analysts and economic observers say the tariffs could devastate key export-driven sectors of the Indian economy, with hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk. That's causing acute pain in India's gem and diamond industry, as well as with shrimp exporters, clothing manufacturers, and carpet makers, all of which have a high number of American buyers. The human cost is staggering, from textile factories to SC, shrimp peeling units. Hundreds of thousands of workers could lose jobs, say traders. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it's about real families losing their livelihoods because of Trump's trade war. But here's what makes this story fascinating from a geopolitical perspective. Both countries are now being forced to pivot away from the United States in ways that seemed unthinkable just months ago. Canadian businesses have been holding off on investments due to uncertainty, but they've also been exploring new markets and strengthening interprovincial trade within Canada.
Yeah, so look, I think we've been going through this for the past 8 months, and I think this has been a challenge for business because they love to live in a world of certainty. And so what we've seen is that businesses have, in a lot of cases, have held off on making decisions, whether it be on investing in capital, investing in people, investing in their businesses, until they can get a little bit more understanding of what this looks like. When you look at the broader numbers overall from a Canadian perspective as well, and Manitoba obviously included in that, what we have seen is a decrease in exports to the United States. Typically in the past, we were somewhere in the neighborhood about 73, 74%. I saw some May numbers that showed us at about 67, 68%. So what we're seeing is that there is being an impact on this. We're exporting less to the U.S. as a result of this. The positive is that, and one of the things that we've talked about repeatedly, is we need to explore new markets. And so we have seen an increase in trade with other jurisdictions, not to the same dollar level, but we have seen an increase in that percentage. So that's a good thing. And that's one of the things that we've continually talked about, is that when you have an unreliable trading partner, you need to start looking at other opportunities. And so some of those opportunities are existing relationships that we have with other countries. It's also about interprovincial trade barriers. How can we do more trade within Canada as well? And so these are things that businesses have been looking at to make up that loss of what's happening south of the border. But at the same time, it's not to the same extent, which is why it's...
As the relationship with the U.S. has soured, India has turned its diplomatic efforts east to China in a renewed effort to restore ties that stalled after a deadly clash 5 years ago along the country's shared border. Think about that for a moment. Trump's tariffs are pushing India, a key democratic ally in the Indo-Pacific, toward China. For the first time since 2018, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will travel to China this week to attend a summit hosted by Chinese leader Xi Jinping, a visit that comes after Trump imposed punishing 50% tariffs on imports from India. This is exactly the opposite of what U.S. foreign policy has been trying to achieve for decades. Successive White House administrations have worked to boost strategic ties with India through technology transfers and joint military drills, working with the world's largest democracy to counter an increasingly assertive China in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, Trump's economic policies are undoing all of that work. The Canada-India diplomatic reset isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a broader realignment that's reshaping global trade relationships. India is also trying to stabilize relations with China, just as Australia, Canada, and Japan have done in recent months since Trump took office and hit allies with tariffs. Carney understands this dynamic better than most politicians because of his background in central banking. He's seen how economic pressures can reshape entire geopolitical landscapes. Remember, trade wars are also currency wars. Remember, trade, the way a country's currency appreciates or depreciates, can have an enormous impact on who bears the costs of tariffs. And Carney is uniquely suited to lead his country in that kind of battle. The appointment of new ambassadors is just the beginning. The announcement follows through on an agreement between Prime Minister Mark Carney and India's Narendra Modi at the Group of Seven summit in June to appoint new top diplomats in their embassies. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was planned diplomacy at the highest levels. Carney's strategic thinking extends beyond just bilateral relationships. In June 2025, Canada hosted the 51st G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta. In his capacity as chair, Carney opened the summit and invited other world leaders, including India's Narendra Modi and Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky. He's building a coalition of countries that can stand together against U.S. economic pressure. The economic logic is compelling. Canada and India have complementary economies. Canada has energy resources and raw materials, while India has manufacturing capabilities and a massive consumer market. The federal government, provinces, and territories are making significant progress in building one Canadian economy. We are poised to build a series of major new projects in the national interest. But there's a deeper strategic dimension here that goes beyond immediate economic benefits. Both countries are democratic allies that have been pushed into this position by Trump's confrontational approach. Even as the United States slaps India with a 50% tariff, placing it at the highest rate tier and one that will push their relationship to its lowest moment in years, one thing is clear. U.S. President Donald Trump is more interested in onshoring than friendshoring. The irony is profound. Trump campaigned on making America stronger by bringing allies closer, but his actual policies are driving allies away. Brazil is the only other country facing tariffs as high as India's. When you're grouping democratic India with authoritarian-leaning Brazil, you're not building alliances, you're destroying them. For Carney, this represents both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is obvious. Canada needs to find new trading partners to replace lost American business. But the opportunity is potentially transformative. This could be the beginning of a more multipolar trading system where middle powers like Canada and India have more autonomy. The personal chemistry between leaders matters too. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was thought to be in a different league. He shared a great personal rapport with Trump during the latter's first term. But that personal relationship couldn't survive Trump's economic nationalism. On the eve of Trump's inauguration in January 2025, Modi posted a warm, congratulatory message on his X account for his dear friend, looking forward to working closely together once again. That optimism was quickly shattered. The human dimension of this story is important to remember. In a sprawling market in the Indian capital, Anuj Gupta sits in a corner of his shop as silence hangs over it. Gupta sources and exports garment accessories, like laces and buttons, to major global brands. But punishing tariffs imposed by United States President Donald Trump have brought Gupta's business to its knees. Multiply that story by hundreds of thousands, and you begin to understand the scale of economic disruption Trump has unleashed. But it's also created opportunities for countries like Canada to step in and offer alternative partnerships. The diplomatic machinery is already moving. Christopher Cooter brings serious credentials to the role. He has 35 years of diplomatic experience and previously worked as a diplomat in New Delhi from 1998 to 2000. This isn't amateur hour. Canada is sending its best. The broader implications extend far beyond just Canada-India relations. Losing India would be the worst outcome for the U.S., analysts have said, yet Trump's policies seem designed to achieve exactly that outcome. When you impose 50% tariffs on a democratic ally, you're not just hurting their economy, you're pushing them toward your competitors. Carney's response has been measured but firm. In his victory speech, Carney had hockey skate sharp words for Canada's southern neighbor. America is not Canada, and Canada never, ever will be part of America in any way, shape, or form, Carney said in response to U.S. President Donald Trump, who has threatened tariffs and floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st U.S. state. This isn't just rhetoric, it's backed by concrete policy actions. As Prime Minister, Carney removed the federal carbon tax on consumers, passed the One Canadian Economy Act to remove federal barriers to internal trade, and expedite major infrastructure projects in response to the ongoing trade war with the United States, and announced a significant increase in defense spending. The One Canadian Economy Act is particularly significant. It's designed to make Canada a more economically resilient and less dependent on any single trading partner, including the United States. Carney's government passed the first major legislation of his tenure, Bill C-5, the One Canadian Economy Act, the same month with conservative support. The bill removes federal barriers to internal trade and expedites nation-building projects with cabinet approval. The defense spending increase is equally important. In February 2025, Carney promised to spend 2% of Canada's GDP on defense by the end of 2030. In June 2025, Carney promised to reach the 2% target by March 2026, and NATO's new 5% of GDP target by 2035. This isn't just about meeting NATO obligations, it's about ensuring Canada can defend its interests independently. For India, the situation is forcing a fundamental reassessment of its foreign policy. Although India has reacted cautiously with its wait and watch policy so far, it is expected that a more assertive response will emerge in the coming days and weeks. That assertive response includes reaching out to countries like Canada that are facing similar pressures. The economic numbers tell the story clearly. As of Wednesday, the export tariffs on Indian goods heading to the United States sit at 50%, and it now says the highest tariff rate globally. When you're facing the highest tariff rate in the world from your largest trading partner, you don't have the luxury of maintaining old grudges with potential new partners. The Canada-India diplomatic reset is happening because both countries recognize that the old rules of international trade are being rewritten by Trump's America. While electronics are exempt for now from the tariffs, a country with a 50% tariff tag on it is hardly attractive for business. And this just adds to the instability and uncertainty that businesses were already feeling because of all the Trump tariffs. This instability is forcing countries to seek more stable partnerships. Canada and India are both democratic, rule-of-law countries with complementary economies. The diplomatic tensions that separated them were serious, but they pale in comparison to the economic warfare being waged by Trump. The broader lesson here is about the unintended consequences of economic nationalism. Trump's tariffs were supposed to bring manufacturing back to America and force other countries to give the U.S. better trade deals. Instead, they're creating new alliances and trading relationships that bypass the United States entirely. Carney understands this dynamic because of his deep background in international finance. Carney has already highlighted how Canada will use U.S. reliance on Canadian energy to try and even the playing field. Perhaps this is a negotiating tactic, and he will seek to reset U.S.-Canada ties following the frosty relationship between Trump and outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But even if it starts as a negotiating tactic, these new relationships have a way of becoming permanent. Once Canada and India rebuild their diplomatic and economic ties, those relationships will outlast whatever temporary trade disputes exist with the United States. The appointment of new ambassadors is just the beginning of what could be a fundamental realignment in global trade relationships. When the world's largest economy starts treating its allies like adversaries, those allies start finding new partners. Trump's tariffs aren't just changing trade flows, they're changing the entire structure of international relations. For Carney, this represents exactly the kind of challenge his background has prepared him for. He's navigated global financial crises, managed complex international relationships, and understands how economic pressures can reshape political alliances. The Canada-India diplomatic reset isn't just about fixing a bilateral relationship, it's about building a more resilient, multipolar world where middle powers have more options. The real question is whether Trump understands what he's unleashing. By treating allies like adversaries, he's not making America stronger. He's making America more isolated. The Canada-India diplomatic reset is just one example of how the world is adapting to Trump's economic nationalism by building new partnerships that don't depend on American approval. This is the new reality of international relations in the Trump era. When the hegemon becomes unreliable, the rest of the world learns to work around it. Canada and India are leading the way, but they won't be the last countries to discover that they have more in common with each other than they do with an increasingly unpredictable United States.